Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. Welcome to each of you from wherever you are joining us in the world. My name is Itza Castañeda, and I am a Senior Advisor on Gender and Environment for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And on behalf of the team here and the co-organizers and partners, thank you very much for your time and interest to join us in today's webinar produced by IUCN with support from USA through the partnership agent. Agent is Advancing Gender in the Environment, and in a special collaboration with the Worldwide Fund on a critical emerging topic that we are going to discuss today, a trait of violence, understanding the gender dynamics and gender-based violence in the illegal wildlife trade. Before we start, next please, Laura. Please know that this webinar offers simultaneous translation into Espanol and French. Please note that to listen to the webinar in your preferred language, you have to download the application Interactio from the Apple Store or Google Play Store. When you open it, you need to enter the event code. It is GBV-ENV. It is usually more convenient to listen to the translation through headphones on a phone or other device, remembering to mute the sound on your computer so you can hear the live translation clearly. The registration email you receive also includes information on how to join. If you have any questions, reach out to us via the chat box. Here is a quick demonstration on how to access to the live translation, please. So now we are going to start with some virtual sessions. We know are now used to virtual sessions, but now we are a few important virtual housekeeping points. First, please be aware that this session is being recorded and will be available on our website in the 3 languages. Note that microphones will be kept muted to minimize connectivity distractions. However, your active participation is encouraged via the chat box. Please share any comments, observations, or questions as they arise through the session. We will be collecting and organizing this to factor into the overlook and we'll on the Q&A session later. Key resources are in the handout box in the control panel. These include an IUCN publication on gender-based violence and environment linkages and the WWF publication that we are launching today. And if you have any issues, please feel free to reach out to the team behind the control panels through the chat box. Finally, a very big thanks to the team behind the scenes, as well as Johnny Seeger, our partners to WWF and USA who make this session possible. We want you to please be aware before we continue that this session discusses gender-based violence and discusses various forms and expressions of this violence, which could be uncomfortable, upsetting, or triggering for someone. Here we aim to create a safe space to discuss these challenging topics that are pervasive in our societies and limit our collective work. We encourage you to take care. Today's webinar will share findings from WWF newest publication realized just today called Gender and Illegal Wildlife Trade, Overlooked and Underestimated, which provides the first synthesis and assessment on the gender dynamics of illegal wildlife trade and provides a roadmap for gender responsive action. Before we hear a presentation on this report in a few minutes, it's my pleasure to invite Renata Cao. Welcome, Renata. Renata is the focal point for WWF Wildlife Crime Initiative in Latin America. She has more than 15 years of experience in the field of nature conservation, and she has led regional initiatives such as the Latin American Alliance for Protected Areas, and she also has served for Mexican government as the coordinator of the Mesoamerican Biological Corridor. And prior to this, she collaborated with the civil society organization Natura y Ecosistemas Mexicanos, working with indigenous people and local communities to preserve natural ecosystems and biodiversity in the Lacandona region and southern Mexico. Renata is a biologist from the National Autonomous University of Mexico with degree in conservation and management of natural resources of the University of Queensland in Australia. Good morning, Renata. The floor is yours.
Hola, Itza. Buenos días. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Renata Cao, and I work for WWF, and my role is to facilitate the development of a wildlife crime hub in Latin America. I feel very honored to be here amongst friends and much esteemed panel of experts. I would like to start by saying thanks to the IUCN and USA for creating this platform to share some of the findings of WWF report, Gender and IWT, Overlooked and Underestimated. The common interest in gender-based violence in illegal wildlife trade is the basis for this wonderful collaboration between WWF and IUCN. I will also like to give a wholehearted thanks to the government of Sweden for funding this research through CIDA, as well as the funding translations and the report and the forthcoming digital gender framework. CIDA's policy of making gender a priority for funding is really positive, as it helps advance this important agenda that might otherwise would be marginalized. I don't like to take too much time talking about the report, as Johnny will introduce it in detail, but let me just say a few points from a personal perspective, as I found it very interesting for our current and future work on IWT here at WWF. The report synthesizes existing learning and identify critical gaps, but also provides practitioners with a framework to integrate gender in IWT programming. We all have faced organizational policies that says integrate gender, but how? Many of us don't even know where to start. This report does just that, provides a guide for practitioners to integrate gender into their IWT programming. This report is about gender. It's not just about women. There are some important findings on the gender impacts on men and women, as it is also important not to lose sight of non-binary or genderqueer as well in the gender narrative. Sexual violence, corruption, and other human rights abuses are documented in the report at various points of the IWT value chain. Addressing IWT without considering the gendered impacts of corruption or the violence against women will then undermine IWT responses in the long term. All of these issues are interrelated, so I am really looking forward to the discussion today. Finally, and before I hand back to the chair, I would like to give a couple of announcements. You will be able to directly download the report from the link throughout the webinar. The report is also available on our website, and you can access it through the link that we'll be posting. The full report, as well as the executive summary, are now available in English and soon will be available also in Spanish and French, and the executive summary will be available in 8 other languages. Building on today's webinars focusing on gender-based violence, WWF introduced a full report discussing issues beyond gender-based violences with a focus on practical gender framework. in a webinar with the World Bank Wildlife Program. We are tentatively looking at September, October of this year. The date's still to be determined, so stay tuned. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, and back to you, Itza.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Renata, for these important initial remarks. For IUCN, it's a real pleasure to collaborate with WWF on these issues, and we look forward to hearing more about the report in just a few minutes. Today's session is part of a webinar series from the Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages Center, which is hosted by IUCN with support and collaboration from USA through our partnership agent. This series aims to build awareness, including by sharing our own research on linkages, as well as new work of partners and peers, learn about challenges as well as strategies, tools, and promising practice from actor sectors, and engage and build community to better understand and address gender-based violence and environment linkages. So today, now, before we dive into the next parts of our agenda, we will be grateful if you could respond to a quick question. We would like to know how you will personally rate your knowledge on gender-based violence and illegal wildlife trade linkages. On a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not knowledgeable and 5 is extremely knowledgeable, and we will collect this information to ensure our webinars are useful and to inform future ones. I'll give you about 30 seconds to make a selection. Laura, please. So here we have the result. Well, we have 33% of not knowledgeable, 42 somewhat, and 15 practical informed, very knowledge and able to address them in my work, 6%, and extremely knowledgeable and aim a source for other 4%. So we have a challenge. We have a challenge on this presentation. And of course, this launching of this document will help us. At the end of the webinars, of this webinar, we will ask you again to take a quick poll at the end of the session. We take your responses into account when developing future sessions. So thank you for sharing your responses with us. We have learned and we will learn a lot. Now we are going to start with the agenda. So today, Johnny Seeger, the lead author of the newest WW publication, Gender and Illegal Wildlife Trade, Overlooked and Underestimated, will present the main findings on the report. With the building, sorry. On this note, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Johnny Seeger. Can you hear me?
Thank you very much. Thank you,
I
Renata.
will introduce you. Wait, please.
Oh, okay.
Or you want to introduce yourself?
Carry on, Itza.
Well, Johnny is a feminist, geographer, and environmentalist. Former Dean of the Faculty of Environment Studies at York University in Toronto, Canada. Dr. Seeger is now the Goldman Distinguished Professor of Arts and Science at Bentley University in Boston. She's an expert on gender environmental analysis, feminist methodologies, and international policy. She has worked in environment and development fields for many years, bringing gender perspectives into environmental projects and programs for governments and organizations around the world. Johnny is also the lead author, as I have mentioned, of this newest publication. Johnny, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Itza and Renata. And I just feel so privileged to be here today. I just want to say how extraordinary it is to be with this amazing panel of women. And it's such a rare opportunity for us to get together and compare notes and discuss findings, everyone working from diverse perspectives in the IWT field. And again, much appreciation to IUCN and everyone in the IUCN GBV Center for collaborating and coordinating this, this webinar. It's a very powerful partnership for this webinar between WWF and IUCN. So I'd like to jump right into a quick overview of the WWF report, which, as I say, a couple of people have already mentioned. We're officially launching today this report on gender and IWT, and my role for the next very few minutes, I'll put on my timer here, will be to reveal some of the findings and some of the discuss briefly some of the analytical directions in the report. This is the wonderful cover of the report, and before I jump right in, I'd like to say kudos to WWF, one of the leading global organizations working to end the illegal wildlife trade. And kudos to them for recognizing and taking the initiative to bring gender analysis into this domain and really taking the lead on this. Many people supported and contributed to this effort. I just want to give a very quick shout out to Rob Parry-Jones, who really took the lead on this and provided the enlightened leadership and support throughout. So next slide, please. Right, so the WWF project had some quite ambitious goals. At the conceptual level, our hope is that we will provide a vehicle to help transform the IWT space into a gender responsive domain, which to this point in time, it really has not been, or has been only lightly so. Our goal also to develop or to help develop new discourses and priorities around IWT and gender, and to really bring gender analysis inside IWT into the broader field of gender and environment, which so many people in this webinar, and I'm sure in the audience for this webinar, have been involved in for many years. And until recently, IWT has been kind of to the side of this larger work on gender and environment. Next slide, please. We also had some specific operational goals for this report to provide a synthesis of what we know and don't know. And frankly, that was a very large part of the findings of this report, what we don't know about gender and IWT, to develop a systematic approach for integrating gender analysis into IWT work, to develop practitioner and policy guidance, very specific practitioner and policy guidance, and to identify key research questions. Next slide, please. The report is organized, the structure, the architecture of the report is around the 4 pillars of WWF and Traffic's Wildlife Crime Initiative. stop the poaching, stop the trafficking, stop the buying, and improve international governance and policy. So the report covers all of those primary pillars. Next slide, please. The kind of top level finding is that gender differences distinguish virtually all dimensions of IWT, and even down to the micro level, there's evidence of really intriguing specific findings. So for example, there appears to be repeated findings, or at least I should say a few findings of differences between men and women in their levels of fear and their willingness to report poaching. There are different gender differences in rules compliance behavior. This is also supported by work in other fields. Men and women have different kind of relationships and social contracts with how they feel about rules compliance and their behavior that comes from perceptions of rules and rules compliance. Men's and women's relationships to enforcement, IWT enforcement, and enforcement actors are clearly distinguished. And most of the enforcement actors in this domain are men, and it sets up a very complex gender dynamics. When we look at consumption patterns, consumption of IWT products, there are big gender differences in preferences and behavior. There are significant gender differences in wildlife management perceptions and participation. Next slide, please. Kind of moving up from specific levels to broad findings, women and men participate differently in all domains of IWT, from poaching through to consumption and policymaking. Men and women have different perceptions of and access to and control over environmental resources, including biodiversity resources. A really interesting kind of path to follow is the notion of economic need, which is so often identified as a driver of IWT. Well, economic need and capacity to meet economic need is, of course, itself gendered, as are the costs and benefits of poaching, consuming, and trafficking wildlife, as are the costs and benefits of ending it. Those are all gender differentiated. And I'll just like to make a very quick note that throughout this report and throughout my presentation, I'm talking primarily about the binary of men and women because that's where the evidence is, but we all acknowledge that in fact it's important to keep our kind of analytical view beyond just the binary. Next slide, please. So the biggest takeaways, here's the kind of headline summaries. Systematic, strong, and consequential gender dynamics infuse illegal wildlife trade throughout, and efforts to curb IWT. And the big takeaway that brings us here to this webinar today and this wonderful collaboration with IUCN is that sexual violence and gender inequality facilitate IWT all along the value chain. Next slide, please. And we make this bold claim that the wheels of IWT are greased by astonishing levels, really quite astonishing levels, of sexual exploitation and gender-based violence. And what we find is that norms of masculinities and femininities and the way these get sexualized expression of these, amplified by the context of generalized gender inequality, it sets the stage for systemic gender-based violence across all IWT domains. Next slide, please. So let me give you just very briefly a very few examples of these. So for example, there are specific sites, and in this sense, I'm actually speaking geographically, of gender-based violence in the political economy of IWT. For example, we find very high levels of rape and prostitution around extraction sites, including, for example, illegal lumber camps or large infrastructure sites where male workers will engage women in both wildlife trade and also demand sex. And we have documentation of these patterns, these dynamics from Madagascar and Uganda, among other places. Next slide, please. There are also sites of concentrated gender-based violence in relation to IWT consumption. And there's this wonderful, horrible, wonderful quote of an unidentified man who was traveling to Mong La, and his point was, you go out gambling. In the evening, you get yourself a prostitute, and then you eat all the stuff you can't eat at home. It's the whole package that makes it attractive. So this hotspot attractive package, if you will, of illicit male pleasure that combines unrestricted access to consuming illegal wildlife accompanied by prostitution and sex trafficking. Next slide, please. We also find what I've dubbed here, just for the sake of convenience, kind of common practices of gender-based violence in political economy. So for example, corruption, which many of the people on this panel are working on corruption in IWT. Much of the corruption in IWT is sexualized corruption. Bribes, for example, demanded from women are very likely to take the form of sexual exploitation. Many people on this panel and listening to this webinar will be familiar with the sex for fish dynamic, where found in East Africa, documented in East Africa and found elsewhere, where gender restrictions that keep women away from fishing for themselves and out of boats, combined with resource scarcity, produce a dynamic where women who want to market, who make their livelihood marketing fish, are highly dependent on men who are the only ones allowed to fish. Often men, in allowing women to market their fish, demand in exchange sex. So there's a kind of almost deeply embedded sexual exploitation in this system. Next slide, please. We found another particular example, but it's no doubt illustrative of other of similar dynamics elsewhere, where in the Kafue National Park region of Zambia, economically marginalized and geographically marginalized women are often feel pressure to provide accommodation for seasonal male poachers, as well as sex. It kind of is assumed that these women who have few other economic choices will not only provide accommodation for poachers, but also provide sex to them. And the shame and secrecy kind of works for both the women and the poachers identified. So the entire dynamic is cloaked in secrecy. Next slide, please. We also have evidence of masculinity shaming of men and boys, shaming them into poaching by saying you have to be better providers for families and households, you have to bring in more money. Young men are often shamed, bullied by older men and or female partners and family members. Next slide, please. And a final example, there's a fair bit of evidence of a not uncommon practice of elite businessmen who are high-end consumers of illegal wildlife products, providing sex workers to each other, as well as sharing in the illegal consumption of wildlife as tokens of respect for each other and to consolidate their business relationships. Next slide, please. So to bring this quickly to a conclusion, let me just say, beyond the examples of which I've just shown you a very few from the report, again, kind of the big picture takeaway is gender-based violence greases the wheels of IWT. It's found throughout IWT practices. And really now to the point of thinking about how to end IWT or to assist in curbing IWT. To curb IWT, we really need to know about these gender relationships. Next slide, please. As we move toward solutions, understanding these gender dynamics and developing interventions accordingly really can be an effectiveness amplifier. Now, we kept saying to each other throughout this report, gender analysis is not a magic wand. It is not going to, end IWT all by itself. But taking into account, being cognizant of, and taking into account the gender dynamics in IWT really matters. It will improve the likelihood of conservation success, and also will be a catalyst in challenging social inequalities. And conversely, gender-blind approaches to IWT result in huge gaps in understanding what's going on in the real world of IWT activities and processes. Next slide, please. So I'll end there, and I really can't wait for the rest of the panel to have their opportunity to speak. So let me say thank you, and this is those of you in the audience, you might want to do a quick screen grab or photograph of this link, which will take you to the actual report download, as well as it being embedded in the webinar architecture here. You can pick it up through the handouts box. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johnny, for this important research and for bringing more light on this very, very needed nexus on gender-based violence and wildlife. We are looking forward to hear more from you during the Q&A session this morning. So now, I just wanted to mention that last year, we also launched a publication on gender-based violence and environmental linkages at IUCN, and probably some of you may see that publication. It is posted here in the webinar. And I think that both publications, and of course the inspiration of many of you as Pam McElwee that inspire us on these publications, are helping to create new knowledge. But it is not enough. We're still having gaps in knowledge. That's why we are doing this webinar this morning. So for continuing with the webinar, it's my pleasure to mention that Pam McElwee is going to moderate our discussion today. Pam is a professor on human ecology at Rutgers University. She has expertise in climate adaptation, ecosystem services, and biodiversity, and has served as a lead author for both the IPCC and IPBES. She has done extensively fieldwork on environmental issues in Vietnam and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. She holds a joint PhD on both forestry and anthropology from Yale. And she is also the thematic group lead on the cultural practices and ecosystem management thematic group of the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management. Pam, very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Itza. It's my pleasure to moderate this part of the webinar where we're going to bring in some additional panelists to join with Joni to discuss the report and some practical examples of how people are dealing with gender-based violence in work in the illegal wildlife trade in different parts of the world. So I invite the panelists to turn on your cameras and come join me. I'm going to briefly introduce each of our panelists that are going to be joining Joni, and then I'm going to ask each one of them to give us 3 words that describe you as a way to get to know you a little bit better. And then I'll ask a question of each of our panelists. Give them a little bit of time to respond, have some interaction with Joni. In the meantime, those of you that are watching the webinar, please put in the chat any questions that you have, and I will be asking those on behalf of those that are watching. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. We have about 40 minutes or so before we need to wrap up the webinar. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. So first of all, we have Trang Nguyen, who is a Vietnamese wildlife conservationist who founded a local NGO called Wild Act. She's been working to tackle IWT across Africa and Vietnam. Currently, Wild Act is running a program called Empowering Women in Wildlife Conservation, which is funded by the USAID RISE Challenge. Our second panelist is Helen Agu, who is a lawyer and environmental law lecturer and researcher at the University of Nigeria. She is an African Futures Fellow of the Alliance for African Partnership at Michigan State University, where she conducted research with Dr. Meredith Gore on women in wildlife trafficking in sub-Saharan Africa. Our next panelist will be Juliana Machado Ferreira, who has a degree in biological sciences and PhD in biology from the University of São Paulo. She's volunteered for the counter wildlife trafficking organization SOS Fauna, and later developed her PhD in collaboration with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services National Forensics Laboratory. She was a TED Senior Fellow and a National Geographic Emerging Explorer. She's the founding member and executive director of Freeland Brazil since 2012, which is a South American branch of Freeland Global. She is currently the coordinator of a counter wildlife trafficking in Brazil project in collaboration with WWF Brazil. And finally, our last panelist will be Julie Violas, who is the Wildlife Crime Research Officer for the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, where she focuses on global wildlife trafficking trends for projects like the World Wildlife Crime Report. Julie has a PhD in criminology from the City University of New York Graduate Center. She specializes in field interventions to help communities, law enforcement, and NGOs apply crime prevention techniques to poaching and wildlife trafficking. She's worked around the world with a range of government agencies and NGOs, including WWF, Flora and Fauna International, USAID, and the New York Police Department. So we've got a really extensive panel joining us to talk with Joni about this report. And I'm going to ask each one of you, in addition to what I've introduced you as, to give us 3 words that describe you and some of the things you're working on. So Trang, I'm going to start with you. What 3 words would you use to describe yourself or the work that you're working on?
It's such a difficult task you're giving me at the beginning of the discussion. I guess the 3 words would be stubborn and never give up. 4 words, sorry.
That's great. I think you need that in this space. Helen, how about you? What 3 words would you use to describe yourself or your work?
Okay, thank you. I am focused. I am very much zealous about what I do, and I'm an enthusiast for environment issues.
Fantastic. Another set of attributes that we definitely need in this space. Juliana, how about you?
Well, I think I'm passionate, energetic, and capable.
Great. Thank you so much. And Julie, how about yourself?
I guess I would say data-driven, nerdy, and also a cat lover.
Fantastic. Great. Well, we have a wonderful selection of folks coming at this from different perspectives. So let's jump into some of the questions. And my first question is going to be for Trang. And Trang, one of the things that your NGO is working on is a project to address GBV in your environmental work. And it's really the first time in Vietnam that this has even been included in wildlife conservation work. And so your NGO is being funded by the USAID RISE mechanism. Could you tell us a little bit about what your project is trying to do and how you think that's going to contribute to addressing this intersection of GBV and the illegal wildlife trade?
Thank you. Well, my organization, YAC, is currently we are the only wildlife conservation organization in Vietnam that is woman-led and run. So 100% of all our staff are women. In June last year, we conducted an online survey to gather some information on the sexual harassment within the wildlife conservation sectors in Vietnam. And the result was really shocking. We have 5 in every 6 participants experience sexual harassment in some forms. 3 in every 8 respondents who have been harassed didn't report the case, and 1 in every 10 respondents stated that they occasionally witnessed rape or attempted rape. So our research has revealed a lack of specific policy to prevent and address sexual harassment as well as the prevalence of harassment itself. And it's crucial that we make some interventions, both practical and contextual, like what work in, let's say, a New York head office might not work in a Vietnamese national park, for example. Our project, we funded by US Aid Rights Challenge, aim to address the sexual harassment and gender-based violence in Vietnamese wildlife conservation sectors. We collaborate with NGOs, institutions, and government agencies to establish a guideline and policy that relevant to our various workplace, like office, forest, village, and so on. And they will be appropriate for the Vietnamese context. We also hosted several series of workshops for wildlife conservation staff and leaders with a total of over 100 participants in the last few months so far to raise awareness about the problems and enable them to identify sexual harassment behavior, how to respond, and how to prevent the issue.
Fantastic. I hope we can get back to some of the details of your project, because it's really a great example of the sort of bottom-up initiatives that are going to be crucial for this space. But I do want to make sure I get a question into all the panelists before we start interacting a little bit more with each other's questions and those from the audience. So I have a question for Helen, which is that, Helen, you're really one of the few researchers that's actively involved in examining the gender dimensions of illegal wildlife trafficking in Africa as a whole. And so from the evidence that you have compiled so far, tell us a little bit about how you see gender-based violence in terms of a factor. How much is it shaping women's and men's involvement in IWT in Africa? And what can we do about it? What are the policy implications of some of your work in terms of making sure we have a gender lens on these issues?
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, we conducted a research on the gender dimensions of wildlife trafficking, but our emphasis was the involvement of women in wildlife trafficking. And this research was a postdoc research I did in collaboration with Dr. Meredith Gar, Associate Professor of Green Criminology at Michigan State University. The research was funded by Alliance for African Partnership at the Michigan State University, and it was over 2019 to 2020. So we were able to look at the women involvement in wildlife trafficking in the trafficking spaces across sub-Saharan Africa. And we conducted it in 3 stages. We did first literature synthesis, which have been mentioned in this report, because before now, apart from the work of PAM, there are really very few works on this issue. That's why I'm glad that this is coming to fore now. So secondly, we have that published already. And secondly, we did an online survey, because at the time we were caught up by this pandemic, to look at expert elicitation of women involvement in wildlife trafficking across the world, so that we can compare it with what we have seen in sub-Saharan Africa. And it was quite inspiring that a lot of issues, because of the conceptual framework we developed at the literature synthesis stage, we were able to identify some primary roles that women feature in illegal wildlife trade, and such as offenders, defenders, drivers, and so on. Then in the main research, which we conducted across sub-Saharan Africa, talking to experts in these areas, we looked at how do the women feature on these primary roles. Secondly, we looked at what are the costs and the benefits. As I looked at the reports organized, put together by Johnny, I was really impressed because much of it is a kind of collaborating much of the findings we had on ground. So we looked at it and were able to find out that yes, women benefit from illegal wildlife trade, but not really because they want to be there, but because of that inequality, economic inequality, not as a result of greed, but as a result of need. And along the line, we found out that gender-based violence plays along much of the spaces because most of sub-Saharan Africa is source level of this wildlife trafficking, and it goes through the transit level onto the demand spaces. So we looked at it and we saw that many women, for instance, you look at the report that we have before us, you see that there is a page where you have the number of arrests of men and women. You find that you have lower number of arrests of women. Then you ask yourself, how come that these women escape arrest? Yes, they are not found at the top level national, transnational syndicate, but at the lower level wildlife crimes, you find these women there, but they evade arrest. Some of them find themselves into compromising positions with the poachers and with also the law enforcement agencies, which demand sexual gratification in order for them to be let loose out of the crime. Some of them also ignorantly or maybe driven out of need provide a shelter for some of these poachers, keeping for them their hunting tools, and at the end of it, they also become subject to, oh God, to sexual molestation by some of these. And some of these women do not talk because they do not want to be seen, you know, as because of the shame. They keep this before them. So I'm glad that this is coming to fore, because this is going to bring to fore all the hidden things that happen in the illegal wildlife trafficking spaces and the demand spaces. And in the course of our work also, we decided to talk to a lot of experts. We are putting together a book project where we want to open voices so that women can actually talk about this illegal wildlife trade. We have the book already together. It will soon go in print, where we have diverse voices from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa, and from Europe. So many of the discussions in this is trying to open up the shade so that we can see the much of the things that go on in this illegal wildlife trade. So I'm glad that this issue of gender-based violence is coming to the fore, and it will be important for programmatic intervention so that women-focused interventions can be built up in the strategies and interventions and future policies to combat illegal wildlife trade. For instance, if we can provide alternative livelihood resources for women, you'll find that many of them will be turned out from being poachers into becoming watchers and even informants, as I saw some women say so in Ethiopia and Kenya. And we find that as women also can be harnessed to come into the wildlife trafficking spaces, especially in the defense area, because we find out that many of them are underrepresented in most of the eco guards, especially in some jurisdictions where they have militarized responses to countering wildlife trade. So we find that women are absent in most of this, which is really not, because some of the responses we got, we find out that as women were seen as being more compassionate and less prone to corruption, and these strengths can be harnessed for countering wildlife trafficking in the future. So what we are saying is that in the end, that it is important to think of this and to have this gender intersections in illegal wildlife trade so that it can inform future policies and programs, and we can have a wholesome agenda in order to combat this trade. Thank you.
Wonderful, Helen. There's so much to unpack in so many of the things that you're working on, and the book you mentioned is something we can all look forward to. So we'll hopefully circle back to a lot of these issues that you raised, but I want to make sure I get some questions in for our other panelists. So I have a question for you, Liana, which is, one of the things we need to think about in the illegal wildlife trade is that it has different dimensions, and you in particular are working on illegal bird trafficking for the pet trade, a very specific part of IWT. Which is a huge part of IWT, I should say, as well. It's happening on an enormous scale. And one of the things that seems very clear is that there's very little systematic evidence about gender differences within the pet trade in specific, either the actors or motivations and so forth. So can you tell us a little bit about your impressions of this? You know, what are the patterns of gender involvement at different stages? How do we think about gender in terms of that pet trade in particular?
Thank you for the panelists. Congratulations, Johnny, for the amazing report in WWF IUCN. First, I want to say that I had never thought about gender and IWT before, so I'm learning as I go, and it's very interesting. Yes, from what I know, there is a lack of data. First thing I wanted to say is that I lead an almost all-women team, so it's strong women making the difference and a poor guy in the middle. And I would like to start with the counter wildlife trafficking, because although it is male dominated, I've seen the presence of women growing a lot, especially in Brazil. And personally, I have never had any problems or issues, quite the opposite. I feel a lot of respect from officers and law enforcement agents. Of course, this is my perception and my personal experience. I think that there is a lack of data, for example, since most seizures are, the illegal animals are caught with men, but maybe we are just not looking for women transporters. Maybe women are just passing with things, you know, in airplanes or in cars, but I don't know. I think that when we are not looking for something, it's difficult to say that it's not there. Here in Brazil, women have been caught responsible, for example, for faking documents and permits. So it's a little bit higher up in the illicit supply chain. So a key woman was responsible for laundering birds that were sent abroad to a criminal organization that acted in 6 countries. So she had a pretty important role. Now, your question, I think that it is the consumers that it makes the most different, the consumer market. So, for example, here the passerine trade, the bird trade, feeds primarily the amateur breeders, the non-commercial bird breeders, and it's just passerines. And this is male dominated completely, to the extent that some women post online saying that the men care more for the birds than they care for the women, and they are complaining, they are competing with the birds, and men love this, especially because of the singing tournaments and other activities. We have a lot of women who are consumers of what we call the granny's parrots, you know, the parrots, the company parrots, and most of them are illegal and from an illegal origins. And also women tend to be very present in the cute animals, owners. So for example, the cute little, I don't know, feline or macaw or even monkeys. There is a well-known Instagram influencer here in Brazil. She owns a capuchin and it's a legal animal, but she completely says that this monkey should not be a pet, and she tries to tell people not to buy them because they can be very expensive, and most pet monkeys are from an illegal origin nowadays. And of course, there are the women who are starting to dominate the cool, exotic animal owner Instagram celebrity. You know, look at my snakes, how I dance with my snakes and my exotic animals. And it's kind of cool to see women in this role, you know, handling snakes, etc. So I think that there is what I wanted to say to Joni and to everybody is that we need to look into this, because all I have is this perception and perception-based evidence without much solid, you know, data-driven methodology that Julie keeps telling me, we need to be data-driven. How can I be sure? So yeah, it is male-dominated, but I think that if we really look into, there may be even connections with the human trafficking, etc.
Great, thank you, Juliana. That really highlights some of the things Joni was talking about, the enormous class dimensions of this as well. We can't forget that that's a part of it, from your Instagram influencer to people on the ground who don't have many other livelihood choices. So a question for Julie. So Julie, you are definitely in this space in terms of thinking about the data that we need to figure out the gender differentiated involvement in IWT across the whole length of the chain. And you are now going to be part of, you're launching this new pilot research project to look at this as a research question on women and wildlife crime in South America. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what this research will be, how you're going to be addressing questions of gender-based violence within that chain type of research, commodity chain research, and what do you think the future research trajectories really should be for all of us based on this?
Thanks, Pam, and thanks to WWF and IUCN and all the panelists and to Joni for some fabulous work. Yeah, so we'll be starting a project funded by USAID looking at women's involvement in the illegal wildlife trade in Latin America. And there'll be two components to the work. The first will be understanding where women are in the IWT chain, really understanding what roles they're playing and why, because I think this is where gender-based violence plays a role in why women are involved, where they are involved, and what's perhaps keeping them in this kind of activity. Voluntarily or not. And the second component of the work will be focusing on understanding women rangers in Latin America and what skill set they bring to the table that perhaps is different from men. And I don't want to make any assumptions here. Maybe they bring a similar skill set. But I think we need to understand a little better how these women do their work, why it's working, but also what challenges they're actually facing in doing their work. Could it be gender-based violence also, or other kind of gender dynamics that are creating special challenges for them? Or do they have the same challenges as men, which I'm sure they also do? So understanding the challenges they face, and then I think one of the research questions that in some ways we're not kind of focusing on right now, but perhaps we should be, is we're implementing all these gender policies in terms of representation of women at certain levels, et cetera, making sure that things are inclusive. But, you know, it's trial and error in some ways. Like a lot of this work is still in its infancy, and we need to understand, especially from women rangers, for example, you're putting in place these policies. Are they working? Do they have unintended consequences? Because gender dynamics are difficult to sometimes see, even for women themselves. I certainly struggle with that. And so are these policies working in the way that we intend for them to work? And are we making assumptions in creating these policies that are not working for us? So I think that's definitely an area that nobody else so far, we've not touched on this. And it's definitely the next step. Once we have a clear understanding, certainly of, you know, how women are playing a role in illegal wildlife trade and why.
Great, wonderful, Julie. That's a great launching point, actually, to start picking up some of the questions from the audience members who are watching us, and to bring in Joni as well, because I know there's some questions from audience members about the report itself, which touches on a lot of the issues that our panelists have raised. So one question that's come in, Joni, is how the report looked at linkages between, for example, transportation of illegal wildlife and then sexual or human trafficking. You know, do we find these to be occurring together? Is it the same people involved in both of these? And do we know about rates of gender-based violence as compared to, you know, other forms of violence in these areas, right? Like what are we talking about in terms of the interconnections here?
Great. I'll pick up with a first answer, but pretty much everyone on the panel could probably address this too. I'm so glad for this question. I didn't actually plant this question, but if I had thought, I might have planted it, because the question of whether human trafficking and sex trafficking in particular and wildlife trafficking, how closely integrated they are, has really intrigued me. And so the end point is, I don't know. I haven't encountered anyone who does know, but I asked a lot of people throughout this project whom I was interviewing, exactly that question about, are these trafficking streams, particularly wildlife trafficking and human trafficking, are they notionally similar, which they are? I mean, you traffic in using kind of similar transportation networks or similar devices and similar vehicles, both literally and metaphorically. But my question to people was, are they the same actors? That is, are people who are trafficking people the same actors as those trafficking wildlife? And I have to say, no one seemed to know the answer to that. And many people said kind of like, there's a little evidence that they might be, but most people said they thought no, that they were separate streams. However, at the end of the day, all we can say is we don't really know. And I think that that would be a really important point for further research and evidence. As I would look to the panel as a whole and say, does anyone else on the panel have any insight into this? But from my research doing this report, I couldn't find anything definitive about it.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly seems to be a common theme that all of our panelists have raised, which is if we don't have the data, we can't know where to tackle interventions potentially. And so the lack of gender differentiated data across the chain, from arrest records to interdiction efforts to who the rangers are, all of these often is not divided out, and so we simply don't know some of these answers. So do any of the other panelists want to jump in on this question? We've got some others from the audience as well. So
I can jump in, Pam.
Yeah, please do,
Just
Julie.
On one point, I think Joni, you're right. There isn't a lot of data on this. It's not been researched extensively. I do think that what we should say when we talk about these things is it's a question of convergence, because there are, shall we say, certain methods that people use to traffic that apply to human trafficking, that apply to wildlife trafficking. There are certain locations that are key in terms of certain ports or certain means of transport that are commonly used for these types of crimes. And so I think there's overlap there. And so that's the kind of thing that we need to speak about in kind of research is, where is this overlap happening? And do we actually also see an overlap of actors? So when we talk about convergence, it's not necessarily about convergence of human traffickers are working with wildlife traffickers, is that they're using similar infrastructure and similar methods, and so they're overlapping.
Great.
And what other people said before today, a lot of wildlife trafficking, especially in Brazil and South America, is connected with, for example, illegal mining and infrastructure work, construction, dams, and they are poaching wildlife, as well as people are bringing women as sex workers for sexual exploitation. For sure, I wouldn't be surprised if they were asked to carry stuff to other places as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And with some of our research we done at the special economic zones, where this place where they have the casinos and they have illegal wildlife trade happening, there's also a lot of brothels and sex workers there as well. And obviously there is a very clear link between, I think that there is a very clear link between these wildlife crimes and many other crimes that are also happening on interweaving together. They are not standing isolated.
Yeah, very important point that the wildlife trade cannot be separated from other issues. Helen, please jump in.
Yeah, I think there is an intersection between wildlife trafficking and other kind of illegal dealing, like human trafficking and even drugs and arm dealing. But the truth is that there is a scenario where young girls are lured into to come in as for tourism, and they are inadvertently made to become transitors, carry some wildlife products without even their knowing that they are being used for such trafficking. So I think there's need to further inquire in this. And secondly, the issue of these studies that we are doing, like much of our studies was based on key informant interviews. There is need to go on ground, like what UNODC is planning for Nigeria, to have such interactions with the actors on the field. I know this is not something that one can be free to talk about, but with guided research, we can get the information and get this documented so that we have baseline data on which to use for these plannings for future interventions.
Great. So we have a question that's come in talking about different types of trade. And so the question is around, so the gender dynamics of, say, the bushmeat trade might be different than the gender dynamics of international illegal pet trade, for example. And so the question is directed at Helen, but I'll open it up to the whole panel, which is, you know, some bushmeat traders, for example, might actually be in positions of power and be women. They might be driving some of these issues and, you know, might have access to capital to pay off bribes and corruption and so forth. So women can occupy these very contradictory roles. And one of the things that seems important to understand is what the national drivers are, the degree to which some of these trade issues are really sort of self-contained at the national and local scales, and when they become international, and if the gender dynamics are different in those cases. So Helen, do you have some thoughts on this issue of scale? And then we'll open up to the whole panel as well.
Okay. Well, I agree with the person that asked the question that gender dynamics, when it has to do with different aspects of illegal wildlife trade, could be different, especially when it comes to like bushmeat trade. But the issue of bushmeat trade, you find out that women are usually not the hunters. They depend on the men to get these the animal products. Yes, they may be the ones manning the restaurants where they are selling and dispensing most of this, but you still have men as their customers. So actually, they are not the one driving the trade, but they are part of the ones that are, you know, enhancing the network. Because when the poachers and the hunters bring in these, it comes to the women, and this is a scenario that played out in one of the research where women has to depend on the men to get the animals, the products. And sometimes for them to do this, they have to give some kind of gratification for them. If not, they will be out of business. The same men will still come to the restaurant and sit down and eat those food. So it is kind of, but when it has to do with it being local and it being international, for instance, if you find that as much of our studies, I don't see women playing out, except for a few instances where you have like the Ivory Queen and the Greenwald case of South Africa. I don't see women playing at the top level transnational trafficking of illegal wildlife trade. They are usually found mostly in the source level as collectors and those that are, you know, bringing in wildlife, even Pangolin case and so on and so forth.
Chang, I might ask you to reflect on this before I bring Joni in as well, because I know in Vietnam in particular, the international dimensions are an important thing to pay attention to. How has your NGO dealt with this lens of scale, the sort of international drivers outside of Vietnam, sources of material of the illegal wildlife being often outside of Vietnam? How do you deal with that as an NGO?
Can you repeat your question? Sorry, it was some of the words were breaking up, so I couldn't get the whole question.
Yeah, how do you the work that your NGO is doing, do you differentiate between working on the international dimensions of the problem, thinking about where wildlife is coming from and what the demand might be outside of Vietnam, versus the national issues? How do you balance where you put your attention?
I think that's quite difficult, because while combating illegal wildlife trade, there's such a huge kind of connection. Like you said, there's a lot coming in from other countries, from Africa, especially coming to Vietnam, especially like rhino horn and elephant ivory and so on. But then within Vietnam itself, we are hunting off our wildlife. Mostly I work in collaboration with other NGOs in Africa to do undercover surveys and supporting them into looking into the illegal trade and illegal activities of the Asian communities in Africa. And then within Vietnam, then we are working mostly with the rangers and supporting them with providing trainings and also providing a safer working environment for female rangers when they go patrolling in the forest for a long period of time. So it's kind of like in Vietnam, we focus a bit more into anti-poaching, and then we collaborate with other countries to work to tackling the illegal trade that was led by the Asian communities.
Great, yeah, that's very practical examples of the need for collaboration across different countries as well. Joni, how does the report deal with this scalar issue? Are there differences that you saw, particularly around GBV issues in terms of the scale that we turn our lens to?
Yeah, I'm so glad that we're talking about scale, because I think that's really key in understanding some of the dynamics. And I want to actually reflect back on what Helen said, that providing diversified livelihoods for women could be, at the local scale, could be a real game changer in terms of also enlisting women, as I think you used the term, Helen, I think you said watchers, you know, that women at the local scale, they know what's going on in their community, in the economic networks, and we often are not able to tap that because of, now we'll go back to talking about rangers and other kind of official observers are usually men, and usually don't talk to, or shouldn't, in air quotes, shouldn't talk with women in communities. And so the question of working at the local scale really, I think, is critically involved in this question of livelihoods for women, and trying to create pathways, provide pathways, economic pathways for women that remove their or lessen their dependency on men. Because just, you know, what we talked about fish for sex, and sex for fish, and sex for fish, and what Helen was just talking about women being dependent on men as hunters. So I think the working at the local scale is absolutely critical. Again, there's my finding is there's not a great deal of evidence, but there are actually a really interesting patchwork of studies that we can pull together, and the work that everyone on the panel is doing now, including yourself, Pam. You're being very modest as the moderator there, but I think this is a critical question.
Great. Well, we are coming to the close of the session, so I'm gonna be very strict and try to squeeze in 2 more quick questions and ask our respondents to be brief, so we have time to wrap it all up. So there's been several questions that have come in around LGBTQ issues, and whether or not those are being addressed in the illegal wildlife trade space. What are the issues we need to know about in this realm? Anybody want to tackle this with a quick 1 minute, 2 minute answer? Joni, is that something that was addressed in the report? Is there any evidence? Are we collecting data on these issues?
There is virtually no evidence. And yes, it is mentioned in the report, and it's something that we all need to be very attentive to and very cognizant of. I think the key here is that if we're talking about social and economic marginalization, groups of people who are kind of multiply, as we would say, intersectionally marginalized, perhaps marginalized, will face all of the same obstacles to alternatives to illegal wildlife trade, to being primary actors in curbing wildlife trade. So, but there's I will say confidently, there's almost zero evidence on this. It just has not been studied.
Okay, yeah, important to include in our data collection. So the last question I want to pose to everybody before we wrap it up, and I might start with Julie and then move to the other panelists as well, which is the illegal wildlife trade is not just a conservation issue, clearly. It's a human rights issue. Whether we look at it from GBV or other perspectives, it's about human rights. So how can either donors or other actors, some of the folks in our audience, help us think about IWT as a democracy, human rights, governance type of issue? How can we get that on the agenda in a way that might help some of this work on the ground? Any suggestions, any ideas? Maybe start with you, Julie.
Sure.
Julie, there we go.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, treat it as a crime just as important as other types of crime. I mean, it has links, obviously. We've spoken about links to other crimes that, you know, a lot of governments seem to place a premium on addressing, like human trafficking, et cetera. Treat it as that. It has implications far beyond just, you know, wildlife that is no longer alive. Like it's far beyond that. And so treat it that way and put the same level of resources there that you do for other types of crime and other criminal behavior. And also the sophistication that you use to deal with other types of crimes, apply it here. You know, it's criminal behavior, there are criminal motivations for it, there are crime prevention interventions for it. Treat it with that complexity.
So maybe some last wrap up, 1 minute across our panel. Juliana, any last thoughts, takeaways from this session, from your work?
Again, I think this is new, this is interesting, this is necessary. And I think we need to keep in mind the importance of the regional based study, because again, no data, just my perception. From what I've lived here in Brazil and South America, many of the things that apply, for example, to African countries don't apply so well here. So let's not make assumptions, global assumptions.
Juliana, you've frozen a little bit on us. That's a great last point, though, to make sure that we. There we go.
I agree with you, Juliana, about not having global
individualized.
Hello.
Yeah, having a little bit of technical. Juliana, yes. I'm gonna. Yeah, Helen, go ahead.
Okay, I was saying that yes, we have different regional applications and implications for this matter. First, let me allude to what Julie said, what you raised before, that IYT is not necessarily a conservation issue, but a human rights issue. And that is why the laws and the intersections and the protection of persons that are involved in this are very, very important. And that is why I'm glad that the issue of gender-based violence is coming up, because this is a human rights issue. So as regards the intersections or their global applications, yes, we have the different spaces in the illegal wildlife trade. Like much of my study, Africa is a source country, a source region, where much of this wildlife is being harvested, and you have transit spaces and you have destination spaces. So it is not what applies in Africa. So the policies and the programs will have to be tailored as regards to each region and what applies to particular regions. And that is the only way we can have a global approach to the issue of wildlife trafficking.
Great, thank you, Helen. Last word from you, Chang.
I think it's also an issue. It's definitely an issue of for human rights, but it also we need to remember that the people who are at the very top, the most powerful people of this illegal wildlife trade network, they tend to, like, corruptions and all kind of things like that going on there, and the people that tend to be arrested and the one that get punished are the low-level people, are the local people who are living in poverty and hungry and don't have anything to live, and they was being used and they've been given guns and method to and push them into the forest to hunt for these richer people, and it's kind of like helping the rich become richer and the poor being poor, and it's clearly a human rights issue.
Right. And last word from you, Joni, before I turn it back to Itza.
Well, I would just say this is clearly the beginning of a conversation, absolutely not the end. And I think we've got powerful interest in pursuing not only research and knowledge on gender-based violence, but on kind of infusing the IWT domain space entirely with gender analysis. So thank you.
Thanks to all of our panelists. Itza, I turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Pam, and thank you to all the panelists. On behalf of IUCN, we sincerely thank you. Thank you also participants for your interest in this topic, and thank you for your time today. We hope that this has been an interesting, hopefully motivated session, and as Johnny had said, the start of many more that you will consider joining. Before we close, we have 2 quick questions to ask you, participants. These questions are to answer and to appreciate your feedback as it helps us to refine our work and moving forward. It's the same style of questions that we have had at the beginning. So the first one is, after this webinar, how would you now rate your current knowledge of GBV and illegal wildlife trade linkages? As at the beginning of the webinar, there is a scale from 1 to 5. And the second question is, was this webinar helpful in raising awareness on how knowledge on GBV and illegal wildlife trade can be applied to your work? Please help us answering these short questions. Well, we have the answer, and we're very happy of seeing these results. 95% answered yes to the first question. Thank you very much. And we are finalizing this webinar, and we would like to thank you again for having joined us this webinar or for staying online. We will also encourage you to visit our GBV and Environment Center and visit our website. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact us. We will be very happy of continuing with WWF and all the panelists and all the co-organizers of this webinar that has been fantastic. Thank you very much to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Gracias.